Hi, all, and welcome to China EVs and More, where my co-host Lei Xing and I will go over some of the week's most important news coming out of the China EV, AV, and mobility sectors. We'll open the room up at around the 40-minute mark to anyone who's keen to ask us any questions. One rule, we appreciate vigorous debate, but let's all be considerate and respectful to each other. What Lei and I discussed today is based on our opinions and should not be taken as investment advice. Even if it sounds like investment advice, it isn't. We encourage those who enjoy this room to please connect with us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, and of course, tune in again next week. My name is Tu Li, and I'm the Managing Director at Sino Auto Insights, a Beijing-based consultancy that helps organizations bring innovative and tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility sectors. I write a free weekly newsletter that we pull many of our discussion topics from. You can sign up for it at sinoautoinsights.com, which of course I encourage you all to do. Lei, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good evening from my side. My name is Lei, and I'm the former chief editor of China Auto Review, which published newsletters and a tabloid magazine in English, focused exclusively on the Chinese auto market. I've spent most of the last 20 years on the ground in China covering the industry. I am now in the US as an independent analyst consultant, still trying to keep tabs on the rapidly evolving market. This week, well, I don't have my usual headlines this week because today, June 10th, is a big day. A year ago, Tesla became the world's most valuable automaker. And today they're launching their Tesla Model S Plaid, right? And quite a few blockbuster events just happened today. Apple, Didi, and we heard from several Chinese smart EV startup CEOs commenting on their future plans just, 24 hours ago. And also, too, you were earlier this week speaking at the, the Shanghai Foreign Correspondents Club. They organized an event called Cars, How China is Reshaping the Auto Industry. So maybe you want to share some anecdotes, some interesting comments of what you guys talked about?
Sure.
And then we go into the other blockbuster news.
Sure. So I was in Shanghai the last 3 days, just got back to Beijing last night, and had some meetings that I bundled up with the panel for the Shanghai Foreign Correspondents Club. So they're essentially club of journalists, and the panel is open to the public. And it was in Maya, a restaurant in Jing'an Temple District. There were probably about 45 people, so it was very intimate, 45, 50 people. And the crowd was really engaged. I think besides myself, there was Bill Russo from Automobility and Steve Dyer from Alix Partners. Alix Partners, for those that aren't familiar, are kind of a restructuring turnaround consultancy that's very well known in the United States. They're not as well known in China yet, but I think we'll see in the next 5 to 7 years as companies run out of money, they could become very, very popular company to be doing business here in China. So first of all, impressions. It was good getting out, interacting with people before the event started, talking to people, shaking hands, everyone feeling comfortable. You know, I think that feeling is still pretty unique even in China, although, you know, outdoor events, because it is summertime here, aren't as unusual, but, you know, to have a smaller room with 30, 40 people, everyone feel completely comfortable, you know, that's still a little bit strange. And, you know, some of the takeaways that I got from talking to the folks that attended were, and this is a little bit surprising because you and I, we live in this, right? So, you know, there are some people that still believe that China is not innovating. And this is people in China. So they probably don't leave Shanghai very often, but I don't believe that statement is accurate anymore. And at the speed at which things happen is amazing in China. So I want to reiterate that, you know, I do think there's a lot of innovation going on here. For many of our comments were pretty eye-opening. And I think a lot of the crowd still actually believes that the large legacy OEMs are just going to dominate eventually again. And I think that having spoken to them over the course of an hour, a bit of opinion changed as we talked about some of the other dimensions, mobility services, software, the big changes in the retail and the dealership networks on how they're going to sell their vehicles. And, we did put time frames on things, but I think, for the general rule, most people still believe that, it's a Volkswagen, GM, Toyota game. We know that not to be completely true. I think another thing that was very interesting that we took a bit of time on was the thought of mobility services and the OEMs, not only the Didis and the Ubers, but the OEMs and the EV startups launching them as part of their platforms and building service revenue. Now, I think it's a leap to believe that every single company is going to be profitable with their mobility services. Just like anything else, there's probably going to be a handful at the top that are very good at gathering the data, analyzing the data, turning that data into new business opportunities. And then most importantly, and I think this is underemphasized, there should be a ton of emphasis on this, being able to course correct very quickly, because data changes quickly. And if you're not able to react or anticipate these changes, then you're going to be left behind. And, finally, one of the other things is, batteries. 90% of batteries are built in Asia. 80% of those are built in China. And now that they're going abroad, there are a couple of European battery makers that are trying to compete with CATL. And there's a couple that aren't as well known in the United States as well. But batteries long term could become a steel or a solar panel situation where there's overcapacity. And I think that's actually a pretty legitimate risk. And so we could see dumping eventually into the European and American markets. So it's important, and this is why Biden is also trying to build capacity, and Europe is also trying to build its own capacity. So, overall, I think the panel was very insightful. The audience, there was one gentleman who posted on LinkedIn and thought that the talk was really informative. So, yeah, it's always nice to hear other people's perspectives, number one, and then get a gauge immediately as to what are the hot topic questions and what people are curious about. So overall, very successful.
Yeah, I envy you actually, because I remember doing a similar event right after the Shanghai Auto Show 2019 with Bill Russo moderating, and I was, recapping the auto show for a similar crowd. Speaking of battery, I think the big news this week was, Apple was reportedly in discussions with CATL and BYD for sourcing, possibly. And I think you were referring to maybe Northvolt as sort of the CATL of Europe, right?
That's right.
Right, which recently got 2.75 billion private placement, right? It's a humongous number.
So really quickly, Lei, for those that aren't familiar with Northvolt, the CEO and founder is Swedish. He's an ex-Tesla employee, and he moved back to Sweden. And they've been very well capitalized, $2.75 billion, like you just mentioned. And they're going to expand into the EU and build capacity. And they have a partner in Volkswagen, right?
Yeah, Volkswagen and Scania, which is part of Volkswagen Group, they both invested another round of money into Northvolt. So I think what was also interesting that somebody shared a screenshot in the article about Apple, in discussions with CATL and BYD, is that they would require whoever supplies the batteries to set up manufacturing here in the US. And obviously, that's what Biden wants, right? Battery chips, whatever, that you don't face another round of, shortage supply. And again, today with Apple's Bloomberg's report on Apple's hiring of Arik Kranz, right? It looks like this is surfacing, gradually it's surfacing out of the water, the Chinese saying, right? We're kind of seeing the stones hiding below.
So let me kind of comment on the Apple and the BYD and CATL. So, BYD already does a decent amount of business in the United States. So I think it's an easier move for BYD than CATL to build capacity in the United States. And CATL is probably less open to it than a BYD. BYD builds electric buses in the United States already with union employees. And so that's two big check boxes already, right? And so the leap is not near as far for BYD as it is for CATL. And with regards to Apple, Apple meets with suppliers all the time, potential partners all the time. So I think it's significant that they have met with those two companies, but I'll bet you a bunch of money that that's not the only two battery companies that they've spoken with. Number one, for their Apple car. And then number two, we have to remember that Apple is a hardware software company and they're experts at batteries too. Now, batteries that power their laptops, batteries that power their phones. So we don't know if it's scalable, but they do bring a lot of expertise as well. So what they're looking for likely is someone that can complement their strengths, but also take a step back and let them control the process. And, we talked about how Hyundai walked away and, a couple other potential automaker partners walked away because they couldn't do that or they didn't want to do that. And so Apple's always going to want control. And I think seeing who might concede that control is also going to be a good indicator of who they decide to go with. But again, it could also mean not much because Apple meets with potential partners all the time. And the fact that they've hired Ulrich, I think his name's Ulrich Kranz, who left Canoe over, 12 or 14 months ago. Yeah, I think that's solid indication of their pivot, right? Because they hired a bunch of people, 200-300 people. They laid off 200-300 people over the course of the last several years. And now it looks like they've course corrected and are ready to move forward.
Yeah, speaking of checking out the boxes, I definitely agree with you there, BYD. BYD's advantage over CATL as far as what it's looking at for now. But others, obviously, what we already have SK and LG plans here, right, in Georgia. So those could be, possible. And then I think speaking of BYD and with respect to these new players, the new tech entrants, the apps, the Xiaomi's, I thought what was interesting to point out is one of the topics I mentioned at the beginning of the program today is yesterday there were quite a few forums going on. And one of them is the Yabli forum in China, one of the highest level forums in China, where BYD chairman Wang Chanfu, he made, I thought, quite a few interesting remarks. One regarding actually, Xiaomi, that he said, you have 100 billion renminbi in the banks, right? You have the money, but also you said it's 3 years of time, right, that you plan to do this. But what is the cost of that time, right? The 3 years. Once you make a decision, you make a strategy, what if it goes wrong? What is the cost of that? It's not as, it might be even more important than what you already have and what you plan to invest.
Right.
Also, he pointed out the fact that we don't want, after the chip shortage, the battery shortage, he doesn't want another round of, we don't want to be bottlenecked by nickel, by cobalt. It's pretty straightforward. And again, he emphasized that BYD is the only one that does the electric motors, the batteries, and the electronic control. Nobody else does it all three at once. So yeah, so
Right.
he's basically gave some warning to the new players that you gotta really think this through. And also, I just saw this pictures of Xiaomi chairman meeting Great Wall Motor. It's another one of those things. Who knows what's going to happen? All these actions going on. It's hard to keep up.
Yeah, well, Xiaomi is kind of the newest girl at the dance, right? And so they're talking to everybody they can to gather data points, right? And they're probably trying to gather intel about these companies' strategies to see whether or not they're going to compete directly with them, right? So it's a smart move on Xiaomi's part to really do their due diligence before they select partners because it's going to be really, really difficult to untangle these deep partnerships once they get into financial commitments, once they get into vehicle development and things like that. And so, to your point, once that gets started and those commitments and those contracts are signed, it's full steam ahead, right? And I don't know if they have the experience. Xiaomi, at least, they don't. They're hiring a bunch of people, obviously, and with automotive experience, but still course correcting with the Xiaomi culture, building a car, manufacturing a car, designing a car, whatever you want to call it. It's going to be the hardest thing that Xiaomi has ever done. And so I, I just get really confused about because it just seems like there are no clear cut strategies besides we're going to be around $200,000. We're going to be like a robot. We're going to be very emotional. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see who they ultimately decide on with partners because Great Wall, they're not very well known for software and connectivity. They're more of the truck brand. So maybe that's how they complement each other, right? And obviously, Great Wall has extra capacity or excess capacity, or they're going to be building it in the near future to dedicate it to Xiaomi. So I don't know. Do you think we'll see an OEM that's also a contract manufacturer that can kind of maintain that wall in between and be successful in both?
Here's the
It seems pretty
interesting
difficult to
thing.
me.
So far, Lei Jun has met with both Wang Chuanfu, BYD's Wang Chuanfu, and obviously Jack Wei of Great Wall Motor. The interesting thing is both Great Wall Motor and BYD. I don't know, maybe even more so Great Wall Motor, that people don't know this, is that it's also a very vertically integrated company and horizontally integrated. Speaking of their, product wise, pickups and all their brands and their own battery, fuel cell, powertrain subsidiaries. So Xiaomi is looking at, these two companies and they're probably assessing, weighing, which one has the advantages or, I think they're thinking this through right now. And also Xiaomi is putting the pieces together. They recently invested into Hesai, right? I tweeted this, $300 million. That was after they invested into Zhongmu, another ADAS supplier. So I think they're putting their pieces together slowly. And, it's like Apple, they're making their moves, but we just don't know at the end of the day what exactly that product or service is going to be. So 2 more years, right?
Yeah, so with regard to your Husai comment, I think that 300 million, I mean, that's a lot of money for a LiDAR company. So could they become the CATL of LiDAR for China? Quite possibly. I think they have broad relationships and partnerships, customers, and the demand is only going to increase. So I think that $300 million is very, very significant.
Yeah, in the LiDAR, Chinese LiDAR startup space, there's quite a few players that can, at least they can try to be the CATL of, or they have the possibility of becoming the CATL of the LiDAR space. So, right, RoboSense,
Right.
InnoVusion, and Hesai. And remember Hesai, they reached an agreement with Velodyne a couple of years ago that, Velodyne sued them, right, for
Yep.
infringement, but I guess they reached the agreement. So
Yeah, we're starting to see clear separation, right? Because let's say Hesai maps out to the Velodyne or the Luminar for the United States, right? And then Horizon Robotics becomes the Intel or Nvidia for China. And so we could really see this separation. I know that these suppliers, these strategic technology companies, don't want to be China only, but we are starting to see national champions or what seems to be the birth of potential national champions for China in very, very important technological sectors. So, one thing that I wanted to get your comments on, and I have comments myself, because Ferrari named a new CEO, and he's a tech guy. Okay, he's a chip guy, to be specific. And the reason we bring it up here is because China is Ferrari's most important market. And so, what's your take on Ferrari hiring a tech guy to be their CEO?
Well, Ferrari, I think out of these super sports car brands, they are probably one of the last to either announce or plan anything in terms of electrification, right? You know, Bentley is going to be electric brand in 2030, and then Lamborghini, right? Lamborghini, though, they just recently announced their new strategy, right?
Right.
So I think Ferrari is probably the last on that list in the electrification space, but it looks like they're moving one step ahead, at least in the I don't know, in the chip shortage. But once the chip shortage is probably going to be a history, in our rear view mirror by this time next year, right? So I don't know that move, how crucial but it's definitely on paper it's interesting. It's like, okay, we're gonna get this chip shortage problem solved this way, our way.
Well, I want to pat ourselves on the back because we did talk about how quite a few companies are probably using the chip shortage as a smokescreen for softening demand, right? And NIO came out this week and said, yeah, May's numbers actually weren't affected by a chip shortage, right? I mean, there was month to month, there was a small decrease in sales, so not super significant, but they did admit that it wasn't because of the chip shortage. So to me, that reaffirms our opinion or my opinion or whatever, that okay, OEMs are hiding behind this as a blanket excuse for poor sales or less competitive sales. So I'm taking those blanket statements by these OEMs with a grain of salt, right? So because Tesla, you would argue that Tesla has probably the vehicles with the most chips in them, and they don't seem to be slowing down that much, right? So, I think it's convenient excuse for a lot of companies.
Even invoice excuse, I thought it might have been a smoke screen as well. It was a weird explanation. I thought because
yeah, that was kind of, it made no
it felt
sense,
like that was
right?
only exclusive to NIO itself. Otherwise, everybody should have been affected. But no, because XPeng got more. Obviously, they didn't have the P7 last year, but still, again, it goes back to we finally got the main numbers for Tesla, and then everybody was like, "Oh, surprise, surprise! They're not doing that bad." But I think actually June will be even better. But then when you compress this into one quarter, and you look at it from a yearly perspective, then it's nothing, right? April is just a little blip for one reason or another. And if you look at the quarter to quarter, can they sustain that level of volume? I mean, even month on month, even if it was down 20,000 units, I mean, over 12,000 Model Ys, when will Chinese EV startups sell one model 10,000 units a month? When is that going to happen? Then let's talk about competition, right? I think from a Tesla perspective, they're still the gold standard. But like I said, but they're definitely not immune to competition. They're still the leaders. We can't even May numbers. We can't really say that's gonna be indicative of their whole year performance because we still have the lag. The order, it's all lagged, right? If we talked about 6 to 8 weeks or 1 to 3 weeks, then really we got to see July, August numbers to see really the effect, right?
Yeah, because could you imagine the scrutiny that these numbers moving forward are going to be? Because to your point, right, there still hasn't been any Chinese EV companies that have been able to go one model, 10,000 and above, right? Which you would think would be a pretty attainable goal, but it still hasn't happened. So there's some sort of cap on Chinese EV makers, okay? And it's not a production thing, it's not a chip thing, it's a can't get enough people to buy thing. And so, because Tesla's doing it, so there's no excuse for that. And Tesla's price point is not mass market level. It's pretty competitive, but it's not mass market level. A good indication of whether or not that can happen is going to be the P5, because at 200,000 RMB or sub 200,000 RMB, that should easily sell 10,000 units a month if the brand is doing all the right things, from creating awareness, marketing, and positioning, and understanding their customer, right? And with Tesla, we're going to see better margins for them as the Model Y ramps, because 70% of the parts between the Model 3 and the Model Y are shared. So they're going to create economies of scale with their suppliers, which they're buying more of the same parts. So that should mean cheaper piece cost. And then we should see probably 1.5, 1.7 to 1 ratio of Model Ys to Model 3s being sold. And currently Model Ys are a higher margin vehicle as well. So I see them getting past these smaller numbers right after the end of summer, and then building momentum into September, October, November, December. And I know you wanted to talk about the CPCA updated forecast, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but I will say that sales forecast can't be hit. The revised sales forecast can't be achieved unless Tesla sells 500,000 units in China. That's my take. So can you tell us about this revised forecast that the CPCA announced?
Well, I just saw this number that was shared when they announced the May numbers on the 8th, Tuesday, right? And I was like, hey, remember what I said, quite a few episodes ago, that I believe 2.5 million units, that was my forecast. And that includes everything, right? Even the commercial vehicles. So CPCAs is saying that the new energy passenger vehicles, right, the cars, sedans, SUVs, MPVs, well, there's no MPV EVs yet, will be 2.5 million units. So
right,
if you add everything else, then what the heck, even 3 million units, who knows?
That's a monster
Yeah,
number. It's a
well,
monster
I mean,
number.
3 million units out of, let's say, 30 million units is what, 10%? And I said reach
Right.
10%. I think in May, at least the percentage share of EVs in NEVs in the passenger vehicle sector was over 11% again. So I think it's going to be, at least over 10% over the next, few months.
There's one thing that should be noted, right? Because that means if that number is achieved, or that forecast is achieved as an actual, pretty much every EV maker is hitting on all cylinders, right? But what's most important is the low end, right? Because that's going to drive the volume. The Xpungs, the BYDs, the Volkswagen ID4s, those are going to drive the volume. So they seem to be very optimistic with how the market's going to turn out towards the end of this year. And this makes a bit of sense, because that's when production is going to be ramped for many of these vehicles, right? Because a lot of production started earlier this year, and so they haven't fully ramped. So, that's just a mind-boggling number to me, that they went from 2 million to 2.4 over the course of 4 or 5 months, because that's a significant percent increase. But they have the numbers in front of them, so that means that those mass market companies, it could be ArcFox,
Yeah,
it could be
well, I
Series as
mean,
well,
if you
right?
look at the data, a good way, I think, Taylor in the room, they do a nice bar graph of, the Teslas versus the Wuling Hongguang, and also the BYDs versus all the smart EV startup added together. And it's roughly about the same, right? If you look at the bar graph, whatever, how many units a month.
Right.
You're going to get these every month. You're not going to see all of a sudden somebody drop to zero. No, you're not going to see that. Consistently, you're going to see them up there. So, I mean, these added together, that's a huge chunk of the market. And we're not even counting, Volkswagen, that numbers for April for the ID4 was not that good, but I think it's going to be, you're going to see more in May and June and toward the end of the year. So I
Right.
think 2.4 million, it's easily achievable. And it looks like we're just right in the middle or past the hardest hit shortage problem, I think. And you
Right.
remember GM revised their first half profitability target because the chip
Yep.
situation. So and then June obviously is for specific cases like Tesla, it's another end of the quarter, right? So push, 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 right? These, at least the leading ones, they're going to reach their guidance for Q2. And there's quite a possibility we'll see one or two, if not three, of the leading startups reach 10,000 units a month by Q3. So, then it's all good.
And that should also mean that customer acquisition costs for these guys would stay pretty low because the market is growing significantly. So, the CPCA is assuming that the chip shortage is not going to be an issue in the second half of the year. Actually, it's going to be completely eliminated, right? And then everybody, to your point, right? If the 2.4 million number is hit, then everybody pretty much needs to sell 10,000 units a month, right? At least. Li Auto has already alluded to that fact, and I think maybe the other companies are being a bit more modest. So it's going to be completely bananas at
Yeah, and
the
here's
rest of this
I
year.
think
So
one interesting point you mentioned a few seconds ago is Xpeng's P5, right? So they still have not announced the pricing for this car. But so He Xiaopeng, he said yesterday at a industry forum that he doesn't believe smart EVs priced at 150 RMB, that's roughly $25,000, if I did my math correct. He doesn't believe that range will be profitable. He thinks the mainstream smart EVs will be priced in the 200,000 to 300,000 range, which leads me to believe the P5, at least with the lighter variants, are probably going to be at least 200,000 RMB. And I think
right,
it's okay. It's expected. I think we talked about this. Maybe the lower end without the LiDARs could be below 200,000 RMB, but we sort of get a sense of
mm-hmm.
what the P5 is going to be priced at. And P5, I believe, is going to meet its challenger from NIO pretty soon, which is the smaller ET. I believe it's going to be the ET5 after the ET7, which it might be the Gemini, right? Gemini, which
Yep,
they said is not the low end, although they are planning a kind of a mass market model or brand.
yep.
So that'll be interesting. But
So I was told that the brand name for the Neo's new brand is called Artemis. Let's see if
I don't
that
think so.
that comes true. Now, so the other thing, the P5, I totally agree with you. So what I believe they'll do is they'll price the basic model below 200 to get people in the door, to get people interested, and they'll try to upsell them to the 220, 230,000 RMB LiDAR filled P5. That's what I think they'll do. Maybe they'll sell at 180 the basic P5, and then they'll try to upsell. That's a pretty typical strategy in the auto industry, and you know that. And you also know that Xpeng has a different set of investors than a lot of their competitors, right? And so just because he said it's not going to be profitable unless we're at least 200,000 RMB doesn't mean that these other companies, and they will, they'll price them below 200. A lot of these local companies that most Westerners aren't going to be very familiar with, they're going to be interested in keeping the plants going more so than being profitable. Whereas Xpeng, because they are trading publicly in the United States, it's very important that they also balance volume with profitability or long-term profitability. And that's always kind of been the issue with the China market, right? These SOEs come in and undercut, which, and they never go out of business because they're state-owned. And so they become zombie companies. And this is what Xpeng and Li Auto, Neo to a lesser extent because they're at a higher price point. That's what they're going to be having to deal with in the China market specifically, right? And so that normally caps profitability for the companies that try to be as competitive as possible. So, I mean, what do
And
you think
part
about
of it
that?
is how to bring down cost. So in the same forum that He Xiaopeng spoke at, right before him was William Li. And he mentioned an interesting number is their average logistics distance per car traveled is 901 kilometers, which saves about 3,000 to 4,000 RMB, $500, $600 per car in just in the logistics cost. And he said Hefei, Hefei is where they make all their cars, is geographically is perfectly positioned because it spans out north, west, right, southwest, roughly about the same distance. But I'll tell you what, I think in China, the best place in that respect is not Hefei. Guess where it is? It's in Wuhan. Wuhan is actually, I think, in the best location in terms of what William Li talked about.
Right.
I think it's going to be even less if NIO was situated there with their manufacturing
Yeah.
plant. And you know,
Well, Wuhan
yeah,
was
yeah.
originally.
So Xpeng, right?
Go
The
ahead.
third plant is in Wuhan.
Yeah, Wuhan was originally called nicknamed the
Yeah, one
Detroit
of
of China,
Detroit's of
right?
China.
But there's hundreds of suppliers already there in Wuhan, right? And being in Michigan or Illinois, it's kind of the same thing, right? Within a few hundred miles of those states are 80% of all suppliers in the world that supply the automotive sector because we call that the lean area. And with just in time, these guys made milk runs. Milk runs meaning that every part every day. That means that every part ships every day, and so the OEMs don't have to carry that much inventory. Again, that might not work, and it's probably not going to work here in the new manufacturing for electric vehicles because of chips. Number one, batteries. Number two, so that's William Lee is essentially talking about kind of the Rust Belt in the United States, the Midwest, Michigan, Ohio, Illinois. It's kind of the same thing. But he's also alluding to more of a just-in-time thing, right? And so there are train systems here in China too that make transportation cheap. So at least on the finished goods side, they can ship cars out to go to West China, South China, North China pretty easily.
Yeah, and Volvo started this, the China, what you call it, the China Railway Express is how they ship Volvos made in Daqing and other cities in China back to Europe, to I think Belgium.
Right.
So I think this is something that will be interesting, to see whether these smart EV startups, at least they will utilize the same route in shipping their vehicles. But then, Geely chairman Li Shufu, he mentioned about the railway cars not being able to ship EVs, BEVs because of the battery thing.
Right. So this is old school. When I worked at GM, I was the logistics liaison for a manufacturing or an assembly plant in Oklahoma, Oak City, and a assembly plant in Kansas, Fairfax. And they both got engines from Tonawanda, New York. And so a typical rail car in the United States is the size of about three 53-102s, which is the full-size semi. And so that's how GM saved money because if you shipped engines over the road in semi trucks, it would be very expensive because these engines are very heavy. And so it would weigh out the truck before it was filled with engines. It would be too heavy if you filled it with engines. And so they saved money because the rail cars are larger and they could take all that weight. But to your point, there's limitations on BEVs because not because of weight or because of volume, but because of the dangerous aspects or the risky aspects of shipping batteries across country. So same, but different. One last thing before we open it up, Lei, wanted to see what you thought of, because I think this is actually very, very important. Ton of announcements this week. Didi finally publicizing their IPO. I think analysts are looking at a $70 billion valuation. potentially 70, $80 billion. But I think, how I want to unpack that a little bit and differentiate from Uber is that Didi is really, really strong. 80%, I think, 70% market share in China. But we have to really look at these companies a little bit differently, right? Because Uber's becoming much more successful diversifying outside of ride hailing because their service in the United States is considered premium, right? I'd go bankrupt if I used Uber every day in the United States. In China, I use Didi fairly often, almost daily. And one of the reasons is because the cost structure is a lot different, number one. Number two, the population densities of Asian cities, generally speaking, right? Now, I'm not just talking China, I'm talking Vietnam, I'm talking Japan, I'm talking Korea. So these ride hailing companies have a lot more people, potential customers, versus the United States, where San Francisco has 800,000 people. San Francisco proper has 800,000 people. New York City is the only city that really has the characteristics from a population standpoint of Asia. And that's with, I think, 7 million or 12 million people in New York City. So, it is different because whereas Uber has Uber Eats and is getting into other services to truly create a mobility platform, Didi has hard stops because Meituan is doing food delivery and they have the lion's share of market here. And then JD and Alibaba do goods delivery, right? Didi is getting into goods delivery, but they're going to have limited success, at least in the short term, because these heavyweights are competing, or these heavyweights own those markets. And so for the foreseeable future, Didi is going to be a ride-hailing company for the most part. So $70 billion valuation. I don't know if the analysts are pricing that in. And then the other thing that I really wanted to emphasize was the fact that the Chinese government over the last few months has cracked down on technology companies and they effectively capped Didi's profitability because they said to be fair to customers on fare structure, to be fair to the drivers. And so, Didi could either become a really, really successful regional company here in China, but that's also why they have partnered in other regions. But, it's going to be very challenging for them to be successful outside of China significantly. So what do you think?
Well, Didi, among at least the global big name ride hailing companies, the Ubers, the Lyfts, and others, they're the
Grab, Gojek.
Yeah, they're the only one that has this autonomous driving entity, right, from a ride hailing platform. The other ones sold them off.
Right.
So that's one, and two, yeah, you exactly right. This Didi has sort of becoming a monopolistic sort of feel, sometimes among the drivers, sometimes among the users. So I think that there's definitely, you mentioned, the government is looking at this kind of antitrust issue, and then they are also diversified, but not as active maybe compared to the Ubers, because Didi, right, they have, I think in their IPO papers, they have three kind of divisions, or the China business, the international business, and the other. The other includes the autonomous driving. And it's interesting to see, the others, the Pony AIs, the Auto Access, the WeRides, they would have to work with the local ride-hailing platform.
Mm-hmm.
So you see these two sort of setups in competition, and who's in the lead, we don't know yet. But IPO, it's roughly 10% of their valuation is the expected raise, right, the capital raise. So it will be what, $7 billion. To again, going back to Waymo, right, it's putting a robotaxi on the roads. It's hard, right? Whether it's capital, whether it's data, whether it's framework regulations,
going global.
Yeah, going global. I think for the near term, we're still going to see these regional players, Uber in the U.S., right? Southeast Asia, the Grabs, Didis, and I think they're also in Mexico and South America,
in Brazil, yeah,
a little bit, yeah. So, but obviously a lot of China focused, domestically focused, and see how their autonomous driving, they're quite behind, right?
Right.
But they do have this ride-hailing consumer huge data, right? So yeah.
And they currently consult Chinese cities, right? with traffic patterns and kind of optimizing the traffic system for them. So, they do have a lot of influence, but they also have two amazingly terrible stains with some of the issues in the past that they've had. So I'm hoping that they're behind that now, or that's in the past, completely in the past. But yeah, so we are at 9:00. I did want to tell the audience about an FT article, and I don't know if you've seen it. I think it just came out last night. It's kind of about the tech worker in China. It's the journalist is Yuan Yang, Beijing bureau assistant chief. She wrote a deep dive on the technology worker in China and how the argument is that there's a lot less innovation. It's just that they put so many resources to a new business. And for those that aren't familiar with how tech works in China, it's a really good behind the scenes rundown of how much of a boiler room atmosphere it is at these top companies, Tencent, Alibaba, ByteDance. And for those that aren't familiar with work, with force ranking, that's essentially pitting one employee against another. It'll be an eye-opener for you if you get a chance to read it. I think it's a good read, and it'll give you a much better understanding of how the China tech scene works from an employee standpoint.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. Lei and I thank you for tuning in. My name is Tu Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at Sino Auto Insight. That's SinoAutoInsight. You can find Lei on Twitter at LeiXing77. That's LEIXING77. If you wouldn't mind rating and or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you grab your podcast from, we'd appreciate that as well. Even better, if you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Please join us again next week as we track down all the latest news on China, EVs, and more.